7th of July, 1946, Howard Hughes took his first flight in his prototype of the XF-11 at his private airport in Culver City, California. Little did he know that that flight could have been his last. But to understand what happened that day, we have to travel a bit back to 1943, World War II. During this time, nearly every aviation manufacturer was competing to get government contracts from the Navy or Air Corps, which at the time were quite valuable. Howard Hughes, a daring businessman, was no exception and tried to secure his share of these opportunities during World War II. Originally, Hughes envisioned a high-speed aircraft to serve a range of roles for the Army, called the D-2. However, due to its wooden construction, the Air Force showed no interest. To salvage the project, Hughes proposed a transformation, shifting from the initially planned D-2 to a D-5 model, which would feature more metal components to meet the Air Force's requirements. The initial design of the D-5 was basically an enlarged version of the D-2 with more metal parts. However, the plane's body was made using a material called duramold, in which they layered wood with resin and shaped it by applying pressure and heat. Howard built a true beast of its time. The D-5 model, later renamed the XF-11, featured two huge Pratt & Whitney R4 360 engines with 28 cylinders, each producing approximately 3,000 horsepower. But that's not the impressive part. The XF-11 was equipped with not one, but two General Electric BH-1 turbochargers. In simple terms, Hughes was about to supercharge the already mighty Pratt & Whitney engines, fully utilizing the power of it, and the smart part of it all was that during cruise flight, one of the turbos could be shut down, allowing the other turbo to operate at maximum performance. This setup ensured the aircraft had spare power when required. You could see it in the statistics of the plane as well. The planned maximum speed was 450 miles per hour, which is about 724 kilometers per hour, and the planned range was 5,000 miles. And it's not just the speed that was impressive. The XF-11 was truly colossal. It boasted a wingspan of 92 feet and a length of 58 feet, which is comparable to a full B-29 bomber. But that's not all. The aircraft had the capacity to carry a 4,000-pound bomb load if required in the internal bay. The XF-11 was a very unique concept to say the least, ready to complete various roles it was assigned to. Although it had capacity for a bomb, it was eventually decided that it would be an excellent fit for missions, where the primary task involved taking photographs for monitoring purposes because of its high top speed and substantial size. But since the Army had several complaints about the design, things didn't look good for the XF-11 project until Hughes sought support by leveraging connections. He persuaded a friend of his father, the Secretary of Commerce at the time, to discuss the project with none other than President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In response, President Roosevelt dispatched his son Elliott Roosevelt, an Air Force colonel, to inspect the Hughes factory in August 1943. Following Colonel Roosevelt's visit, he composed a compelling letter to General Henry Hap Arnold, the Chief of the Air Force, advocating for the XF-11 as an ideal photographic reconnaissance aircraft. Roosevelt went to great lengths, even suggesting that deploying a small number of these planes could potentially lead to victory within 6 months. This influential recommendation, shared with President Roosevelt, marked a crucial turning point in the XF-11 project's history. However, the Army's Air Force still had some doubts about the fragile duramold construction and the use of wood in general. To address this issue once and for all, Hughes agreed to redesign the wings and tail booms with an all-metal construction, while retaining the duramold construction for the body of the plane. This compromise aimed to finally win over the Chief of the Air Force and get the XF-11 project moving in the right direction. Following Hughes's agreement to modify the plane model, the order was placed for the military. However, it's important to note that this decision wasn't without opposition from the staff, who held reservations about the choice. With all the necessary support from key figures, Hughes was awarded a contract for 100 XF-11s on October 6, 1943, and the plan was to designate 2 aircraft as prototypes, with the remaining 98 intended for production. However, when the initial $43 million contract was awarded on October 11, 1943, Howard Hughes swiftly reacted. He insisted on compensation of his earlier built D-2 model as well, because he believed that was a significant contribution to the development of the XF-11. The U.S. Army disagreed and was determined not to give in. They argued that Howard Hughes had started the D-2 project without consulting them and had kept important information about the aircraft to himself. This clash between Hughes and the U.S. Army became a crucial part of the XF-11 story. As the talks between Howard Hughes and the U.S. Air Force went on, the military agreed to some small design changes. However, Hughes had to let go of his hope for full reimbursement and accept most of the requested design modifications, which included getting rid of the Duramold. These lengthy negotiations stretched over almost a year, causing significant delays in the XF-11 program. Originally, the delivery of the first XF-11 was scheduled for November 1944, and at the height of production, the Hughes Company aimed to deliver 10 aircrafts per month by March 1945. However, as any aircraft manufacturer eventually discovers, delays were encountered almost immediately. The U.S. Army warned him that they were thinking of canceling the XF-11 because it wasn't making any significant progress. In response to the critical situation, Hughes enlisted Charles Perrell, a former vice president of production at Consolidated Vultee, to oversee the XF-11 program. Upon joining, Perrell encountered a significant challenge. Hughes's team lacked the necessary experience in designing and constructing airplanes. The XF-11 project faced early challenges, including the delayed arrival of 6 months of the prototype's wings, well past the expected delivery date of April 1945. The worst setback for Hughes was that the end of the war in Europe was nearing, causing the U.S. Army to cancel a substantial portion of their XF-11 orders, which eventually resulted in an order of only 3 units instead of the originally planned 100 units. For the new order, a static test model and 2 prototypes were expected. Adding to the hurdles, the engines were delivered 7 months behind schedule in September 1945. Despite these setbacks, Charles Perrell successfully steered the project back on course, and the U.S. Air Force conditionally accepted the first prototype on April 5, 1946, marking a significant stride in the XF-11's development. Nevertheless, Howard Hughes was soon to face the consequences of his own stubbornness. The first XF-11 prototype was finally finished on April of 1946 for the first test flight, but yet again problems were encountered. After several redesigns, the aircraft resumed operational testing in early July. Hughes was still hoping for a change of heart from the Army Air Force, and in a bold move, he decided to make the next test flight a full flight, which he would later regret. Hughes neglected to get a full briefing from his engineers, who would have likely reminded him about a propeller seal leak, which could quickly become life-threatening if he flew for longer than 45 minutes. That's why the Army Air Force had communicated that the first test should last no more than 45 minutes, keep the landing gear down and locked, and maintain communication with their chase plane. But the stubborn Hughes had other plans. He loaded the XF-11 with 1,200 gallons of fuel, twice as much as required. Once Hughes took off to the sky, radio failures prevented him from establishing contact with the chase plane the Army Air Force had specifically fielded for this test. So with a leaking propeller hub, essentially no regard for safety precautions, and no radio communication, Hughes departed Culver City in the first prototype of the XF-11. He tried to retract his landing gear right after takeoff, but as expected, something went wrong. What should have been the moment of a great triumph quickly devolved into a nightmare. The landing gear position indicator failed to show a successful retraction of the right main gear. To troubleshoot, Hughes flew over the Pacific before turning back toward land, all the while trying to fix his gear several times to hopefully achieve a successful retraction. After 1 hour and 15 minutes of total flight time, another problem occurred. The propeller seal leak on the right rear propeller had exhausted its supply of oil. This caused the propeller blades to move into a flat configuration, creating an enormous amount of drag. Instead of shutting down the engine and adjusting the propellers to minimize aerodynamic drag, Hughes chose to keep the right engine at full power while reducing power on the left. This was an attempt to control the aircraft's tendency to go to the right. If Hughes had just stuck to the original flight plan, he wouldn't have been troubleshooting his landing gear, nor would he have depleted the oil from the propeller's reservoir. Furthermore, because they had no means of communication with Hughes, and upon seeing the aircraft turning back toward land, the A-20 chase planes that were guiding Hughes through his test flight assumed that Hughes was heading to return to his airport on Culver City. Consequently, they broke formation and returned to their own airfield. Barely able to control the aircraft and rapidly losing altitude due to these adjustments to maintain a controllable airspeed, Hughes made a forced landing attempt. He tried to stretch his glide to the Los Angeles County Club's golf course. However, due to the excessive drag from the propeller, he landed short and crashed into 3 houses on North Whittier Drive, Beverly Hills, California. The ensuing fire consumed the prototype and one of the houses and caused significant damage to the others. Howard Hughes sustained serious injuries in the crash. Unfortunately, the prototype was also destroyed. In an astonishing turn of events, Hughes managed to pull himself from the wreckage before being assisted by neighborhood residents and paramedics. Following the accident, Hughes endured severe injuries, including extensive burns, 11 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and a displaced heart. But the crazy thing is, he went on to make a full recovery. However, his journey toward recovery took a turn as he developed a codeine addiction that would persist for the rest of his life. Following investigations by the U.S. Air Force, the crash was attributed to a loss of hydraulic fluid, causing the failure of the pitch change mechanism in the right rear propeller. Despite this, Hughes pursued legal action against Hamilton Standard, successfully suing them for the malfunctioning contra-rotating blades in the right propeller. In response to this harrowing incident, the propellers on the next prototype were replaced with a single set of 4-bladed propellers. Some might call him crazy, but after the horrific crash, Hughes remained consistent to pilot the second prototype himself. Initially, the U.S. Air Force prevented Hughes from flying the aircraft due to worries about his previous crash. However, he personally deposited a $5 million bonds payable and told the U.S. Army to keep it if he were to crash again. So the military eventually gave in. On April 4, 1947, Hughes took to the skies in the second XF-11 prototype on its first flight, departing yet again from Hughes Airport, but this time things went different. During this second attempt, the test flight proceeded without major incidents, showcasing the aircraft's stability and control at high speeds. After several other test flights, the aircraft was then sent to the Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. It was noted for its excellent flying characteristics, but criticized for poor reliability because navigators found it challenging to access the cameras in flight. Unfortunately, the project was eventually canceled. The decision favored the Northrop F-15 Reporter and Boeing RB-50 Super Fortress, both reconnaissance aircraft based on existing combat models already in production. Besides that, many B-29 and B-50 bombers from the war had already been converted into reconnaissance aircrafts, which were less expensive to operate than the XF-11. The surviving prototype underwent operational suitability testing and served as a ground maintenance trainer for a period. Ultimately, the XF-11 program incurred a cost of over $14 million for the federal government. While the XF-11's added speed and performance were out of reach for most of the competition at the time, the Air Force decided to allocate its resources to more efficient projects. As a result, the XF-11 was transferred to Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls in July 1949, where it remained unused until it was unfortunately scrapped in November 1949, which marked of the XF-11, a plane with an unknown potential. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and until next time.